Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. After Napoleon's defeat, France returned to Europe as a power whose strength was now subject to management. The Congress of Vienna restored its borders and monarchy, but it also produced a shared understanding among the other European powers that French expansion had to be contained. France remained large, populous, and economically capable, yet its freedom to act inside Europe was now constrained by the recent memory of continental war. The restored Bourbon monarchy governed a country that remained politically unstable. Repeated changes of regime, social unrest, and unresolved revolutionary legacies continued to shape domestic politics. At the same time, France's diplomatic position was limited. When France participated in European affairs, it did so under arrangements designed to prevent disproportionate gains. Prestige and influence remained central to French political culture, but the traditional continental routes to restoring them had effectively been closed. This produced a structural dilemma. France required visible avenues for ambition to stabilize its domestic political life and to maintain recognition as a great power. However, any attempt to revise European borders risked triggering collective opposition. European balance of power mechanisms did not eliminate French strength, but they significantly narrowed the range of acceptable actions. Overseas territories offered a different strategic environment. France retained minor holdings in the Caribbean, India, and parts of the African coast, but most of its older colonial system had collapsed. Canada had been lost to Britain, Louisiana had been sold to the United States, and Haiti had become independent. These losses had reduced France's overseas influence, yet they also meant that colonial expansion was no longer viewed as a primary political project. During the early 19th century, European attention increasingly shifted outward. Britain concentrated on maritime trade, and India-Russia expanded across Central Asia, and Iberian powers declined in relative strength. As continental Europe stabilized, imperial competition increasingly unfolded beyond Europe itself. Within this environment, a distinction emerged. French actions inside Europe were closely monitored and constrained, while French actions beyond Europe drew less immediate resistance. Overseas interventions, particularly when framed as stabilizing or protective, did not threaten the continental balance in the same way. This created a strategic asymmetry between Europe and the wider world. By the time France began to reassert itself overseas, Africa occupied a distinct position. Much of the continent remained formally unclaimed by European states. France already possessed footholds along its northern and western edges, and Africa lay outside the diplomatic tripwires that defined European security. If France were to regain visible international stature without reopening continental conflict, Africa offered the least constrained arena in which to begin. France's renewed engagement in Africa initially took the form of intervention rather than declared colonial expansion. In 1830, French forces landed in Algiers under the stated purpose of suppressing piracy and disrupting slave trading networks operating from the North African coast. These activities had long affected Mediterranean commerce and provided a legitimate framework for limited military action. Such interventions were already familiar to European diplomacy. Naval campaigns against piracy and slave trading had precedent, and they did not immediately challenge the continental balance of power. France's actions in Algiers therefore entered the international system as a stabilizing operation rather than as a formal act of imperial enlargement. This framing shaped how other powers evaluated French involvement. Over time, the French military presence in Algeria developed into a permanent administrative system. Military campaigns expanded inland, treaties were concluded with local authorities, and settlement policies were introduced. Resistance from local populations was sustained, yet external resistance from European powers remained limited. France was able to consolidate territorial control without provoking collective diplomatic opposition. The Algerian experience established a functional expansion model. Overseas territorial growth could proceed incrementally through security operations, administrative necessity, and treaty-based authority rather than through explicit declarations of empire. Moral language surrounding public order suppression of raiding and disruption of slave trading networks operated as a diplomatic instrument that reduced external resistance. At the same time, Algeria demonstrated that permanent overseas holdings could be sustained politically within France. The colony produced administrative structures, military experience, and visible symbols of renewed international presence. These outcomes reinforced the perception that overseas expansion could serve as a viable instrument of national recovery. By mid-century, colonial expansion was no longer viewed as a residual inheritance from an earlier era. It had become a functional strategy through which France could regain visibility and influence beyond the constraints imposed inside Europe. Algeria was no longer an exception. It became the initial operational platform for further outward expansion. The transition from limited intervention to systematic overseas expansion became clearer under Napoleon III. When he consolidated power in the early 1850s, he inherited both the diplomatic constraints placed on France within Europe and the operational precedent established in Algeria. His government did not pursue large-scale continental revision. Instead, it directed expansion toward regions where European balance of power mechanisms were less restrictive. This strategy rested on material considerations. France sought secure access to raw materials, new markets for manufactured goods and populations that could be administered, taxed, and incorporated into imperial labor and military systems. As industrial competition intensified in Europe overseas, territories offered a means of meeting these demands without reopening continental conflict. Political and cultural factors reinforced this direction. Catholic institutions remained closely tied to French state identity. As British, Dutch, and Russian expansion proceeded under Protestant and Orthodox frameworks, French policymakers increasingly framed overseas expansion as a mission that combined administrative order, commercial integration, and religious influence. Missionary networks and colonial administration developed in parallel, providing both practical infrastructure and moral justification. France's expansion into Southeast Asia followed this pattern. Through treaties, military expeditions, and the establishment of protectorates, French authority gradually extended across territories that would later form French Indochina. Each phase could be presented as limited, stabilizing, and administratively necessary. Cumulatively, these actions formed an expanding imperial system without requiring overt declarations of continental ambition. Simultaneously, Napoleon III emphasized restraint within Europe. Although France engaged in selective territorial adjustments through alliance diplomacy, official policy stressed that France did not seek European domination. These assurances reduced foreign resistance and allowed France to maintain cooperative relations with other powers while expanding overseas. By the late 1860s, France possessed multiple overseas footholds, standardized colonial administrative practices, and a political framework that treated imperial expansion as both functional and legitimate. However, this outward orientation did not remove continental vulnerability. It only redirected French strategic energy beyond Europe, where its long-term consequences had yet to be determined. France's outward-oriented strategy did not prevent renewed conflict in Europe. In 1870, diplomatic tensions escalated into war between France and the North German Confederation. The conflict ended rapidly in French defeat. Napoleon III was captured, the Second Empire collapsed, and a unified German state emerged. The loss altered France's political position within Europe and publicly confirmed the limits of its continental power. The Third Republic inherited a nation that was politically unsettled and diplomatically constrained. Germany now occupied a dominant position in Central Europe, and French leaders recognized that immediate continental revision was unlikely to succeed. At the same time, domestic political life was shaped by the memory of defeat, which generated pressure for visible national recovery. Within this context, colonial expansion assumed a new strategic role. It became a means of restoring international standing without provoking immediate European confrontation. Overseas territories could supply resources, manpower, and political symbolism while operating beyond the primary arena of German power. European imperial geography further reinforced this logic. Britain already possessed extensive overseas holdings and showed limited interest in restricting French expansion outside Europe so long as core maritime routes were not threatened. Germany's overseas infrastructure remained limited, and Iberian powers lacked the capacity to contest large-scale expansion. These conditions created an external environment favorable to French overseas growth. Africa emerged as the most suitable arena for this renewed strategy. France already possessed established military and administrative structures in Algeria, which provided a base for further operations. From this foundation, expansion could proceed across territories that had not yet been formally incorporated into European imperial systems. By the early 1880s, colonial growth had become embedded in French strategic planning. Overseas expansion was no longer a peripheral project. It had become a primary instrument through which France sought to compensate for its constrained position within Europe. Africa presented structural conditions that differed significantly from other regions of imperial competition. Much of the continent had not yet been formally incorporated into European colonial systems. While coastal enclaves and established trade networks existed, large interior territories remained outside direct European administration. This allowed expansion to proceed through treaties, military columns, and administrative posts without immediate confrontation with rival empires. France also entered this phase with operational advantages. Algeria had developed into a consolidated colonial base with ports, garrisons, and experienced administrative personnel. From this platform, French forces could move westward across trans-Saharan routes and southward along major river systems, opening sustained access to the interior of West Africa. Africa offered scale in a way that other regions did not. Large contiguous territories could be linked into unified administrative zones. This continuity had political value. Visible territorial mass functioned as a substitute measure of international standing at a time when France's influence inside Europe was constrained. Economic considerations reinforced this direction. African territories were expected to supply agricultural land mineral resources and labor that could be integrated into French imperial markets. While immediate profitability varied, colonial planning prioritized long-term infrastructural development taxation systems and concessionary enterprises that would bind African economies to metropolitan France. Africa also posed a lower immediate risk of European war. Because most African frontiers were still being defined, disputes could often be settled through negotiation rather than revisionist conflict. This reduced the diplomatic cost of rapid territorial acquisition. Although some French political leaders questioned the value of overseas expansion, African campaigns encountered less resistance than those in Asia. The language of suppressing raiding, ending slave trading networks, and establishing administrative order resonated more effectively in public debate. As a result, African expansion acquired institutional momentum. As French expansion accelerated, the risk of confrontation among European powers increased. Multiple states were advancing into the African interior along intersecting river systems and trade routes. Without standardized rules, overlapping claims threatened to escalate into interstate conflict. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was convened to establish a framework for recognizing colonial possession. Rather than pre-dividing Africa, the conference defined procedural principles governing future claims. The most consequential of these was the doctrine of effective occupation. Under this principle, territorial claims required demonstrable administrative and military presence. Ownership was to be based on exercised authority rather than declaratory assertion. This rule produced asymmetric effects. States with standing colonial armies, logistical networks, and administrative systems were able to meet the new requirements. States lacking such capacities were effectively excluded from large-scale participation. France's existing colonial infrastructure, developed primarily through its Algerian administration, aligned closely with the new legal framework. Effective occupation converted operational capacity into recognized sovereignty. Wherever French expeditions established posts, signed treaties, and built administrative structures, legal control could be formalized. Speed, continuity, and logistical reach now translated directly into durable territorial claims. The conference also framed colonial expansion through humanitarian objectives, particularly the suppression of slave trading networks and the promotion of commercial access. These principles reinforced the diplomatic language France had already employed, allowing expansion to be presented as compliance with international norms. Once these rules were established, competitive expansion intensified. French columns advanced outward from existing bases, linking coastal territories to interior regions through chains of administrative posts. The legal structure of empire had now been aligned with France's operational capabilities. Colonial expansion did not proceed without domestic political constraint. Parliamentary debates reflected concern over the financial and human costs of overseas campaigns. Military operations in Southeast Asia had been prolonged and costly, generating public scrutiny and legislative resistance. Opposition also emerged from nationalist figures who prioritized continental security over overseas expansion. They argued that imperial commitments dispersed military resources and delayed preparation for renewed confrontation with Germany. From this perspective, colonial growth risked weakening rather than strengthening national defense. Africa was treated differently within these debates. Military campaigns on the African continent were generally shorter in duration, geographically closer, and more easily framed as limited administrative operations. Official reporting emphasized suppression of raiding, disruption of slave trading networks, and establishment of administrative order. These narratives reduced political resistance and facilitated continued authorization. This divergence shaped policy outcomes. Expansion in Asia encountered growing skepticism, while African campaigns continued to receive funding and political approval. Colonial administrative systems increasingly concentrated on West and Central Africa, where territorial consolidation proceeded steadily. Institutional momentum reinforced this pattern. Colonial military commands, administrative posts, and commercial concessions became linked to African territories, generating professional and political constituencies that favored continued expansion. Public opinion did not actively demand empire, but it did not strongly oppose African expansion either. The lower visibility of costs and the humanitarian framing of operations created a stable domestic environment for continued territorial growth. External resistance to French expansion proved limited. Spain and Portugal retained historical claims in parts of Africa, but lacked the financial and military capacity to enforce them across extensive interior territories. Their strategic priority was maintaining existing possessions rather than contesting French advances. Germany, despite its growing power in Europe, possessed comparatively limited colonial infrastructure. Its diplomatic and military attention remained focused primarily on continental consolidation. Africa constituted a secondary arena, and German capacity to project sustained power deep into the interior remained constrained. Britain approached African competition selectively. Rather than opposing French expansion in general, British policy focused on protecting key maritime routes and access to strategic corridors linked to imperial trade. As long as French advances did not threaten these interests, London tolerated large-scale French acquisitions. In some cases, French expansion was viewed as preferable to German expansion. This produced a pattern of negotiated accommodation. Disputes were more often resolved through bilateral agreements than through military conflict. Frontiers were adjusted through treaties, allowing French expansion to proceed without triggering collective opposition. Unlike earlier continental expansions, which had produced unified coalitions against France, African expansion was treated as manageable within the existing diplomatic system. This permissive environment enabled France to consolidate large contiguous territories across West and Central Africa. As French holdings expanded, territorial configuration became an explicit strategic concern. Policymakers and military planners increasingly prioritized continuity and visible scale. Large connected zones of control created the appearance of a coherent imperial system rather than a series of isolated enclaves. This territorial continuity carried political value. Extensive shaded regions on imperial maps signaled that France retained global standing despite its constrained influence within Europe. The physical size of overseas holdings functioned as a symbolic measure of power alongside their material utility. This logic influenced operational decisions. French expeditions sought to link coastal enclaves to inland territories through corridors of administrative control. Posts were established along river systems, trade routes, and desert crossings to create continuous territorial chains. Political claims were often secured prior to full economic development. The emphasis on breadth reflected strategic calculation. Controlling large spatial zones preempted rival claims and preserved flexibility in future negotiations. Territories could be consolidated later, but they could not be reclaimed once conceded. Institutional incentives reinforced this orientation. Colonial officers were rewarded for extending territorial reach and linking administrative zones. Colonial governance systems evolved to manage broad areas even where population density remained low. By the early 20th century, France's African empire had assumed a contiguous territorial form that would define its imperial geography for decades. By 1914, France's African empire had become integrated into the structural foundations of the French state. Colonial administrations supplied labor tax revenue and raw materials while also providing a reservoir of military manpower. These territories were no longer peripheral possessions. They had become embedded within national defense planning and imperial logistics. The First World War further reinforced this structure. Following Germany's defeat, its African colonies were redistributed among the victorious powers. France received additional territories that expanded its existing African system. The administrative and military frameworks developed since the 1880s allowed France to absorb these regions without disrupting imperial continuity. These acquisitions further stabilized Africa's role within French strategic planning. The empire functioned simultaneously as a material resource base, a manpower reservoir, and a visible measure of international standing. Colonial holdings were now structurally inseparable from France's conception of great power status. In the decades that followed, imperial maintenance persisted not simply through inertia, but through institutional dependency. Military planning, economic integration, and diplomatic positioning all assumed the continued existence of the African empire. When decolonization eventually dismantled this system in the mid-20th century, it did so by undoing a structure that had been assembled incrementally across multiple generations. France's extensive African holdings were the cumulative result of constrained choices. Legal frameworks, permissive diplomacy, and strategic substitution for continental limitation.